All right, welcome back to the pod, ladies and gentlemen. Today I got with me cloud of witnesses. Jeremiah, how you doing today? Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Introduce yourself to the audience.
Absolutely. Jacob, thank you for having me on your podcast. I really
Sure.
appreciate the opportunity. Um,
Mhm.
it's one of my favorite things about being kind of in this realm doing cloud of witnesses is getting to meet people like you and getting to talk on on a certain level, right? Like this is obviously a little different than if you and I ran into each other at a Starbucks or or after after church during an agape, right? This is kind of we both know why we're here. We want to learn more about each other and about each other's faith, and so I really appreciate your reaching out and wanting to have this conversation because I think this kind of thing is what changes people's lives ultimately. Much more so, you and I were even talking before this
Mhm.
recording started. You know, debate online is a big deal, and I think there's a great value in it. But personally, I feel there's even more value in just people coming together even when we might have different views at the time, to be able to have a conversation, right, to talk about these things from a very human perspective, where hopefully it's charitable and people are appreciating each other, and oftentimes wanting to see the best in the other person, because as you know, in the debate world, it often turns into whoever's on the other side is of the devil. And I think those can be, although very entertaining and still you can learn a lot as
Mhm.
well. I feel like people oftentimes are just drawing in the lines, and that's they're not going to budge, even when
Yeah.
they get bested sometimes. So, anyways,
Mhm.
I do appreciate it, Jacob.
Sure.
About me personally, I have a long history in the faith, thanks be to God. Although much of my earlier years were spent just kind of um, wayward, and I certainly call myself, I am the prodigal son,
Mhm.
and thanks be to God, that I'm here today, able to call myself, someone who is doing their best to pick up their cross every day, and follow
Sure.
Christ. I was raised in a non-denominational, evangelical Christian home.
Mhm.
Generally speaking, my mother and father were both children of the Jesus Revolution, which you've maybe heard of. This is that period of time in the late '60s. These are all these post hippies
Mhm.
who found Jesus, and the Calvary Chapel movement under Chuck Smith was started right here in Southern California. I'm in San Diego right now.
Mhm.
And my parents were part of that. They found Christ. They came, to faith in that time period. Um, and me, even as a baby, as an infant child, I was actually dedicated, I was prayed over by Chuck
Mhm.
Smith himself, which
Oh,
I was,
wow.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, looking back on it, it's kind of interesting,
Mhm.
So I was blessed enough. My parents sent me to a private Christian school. It was a Baptist school, but really its theology was, very much in line what you might call modern day, dispensationalism, kind of the
Mhm.
Schofield Bible stuff. So I grew up, my early memories as, a young kid going through primary school, we had chapel every Thursday. I remember talking with my friends. We had plans, Jacob, for
Mhm.
when the tribulation was going to come. We had plans for, okay, we're going to go up into the mountains. We had our backpacks. We were going to get food and guns, and because we lived in this world at that time,
Mhm.
that church was, the school was a pre-tribulational rapture view,
Okay.
right?
Uh,
And we can get into all that stuff at some point, maybe not on this podcast episode per se, but
yeah.
needless to say, I was a child of, this very American evangelical, I didn't know it at the time, but modern view, right? This dispensationalism, which, as we know, is in its infancy, really, when you look
Mhm.
at the history of the church. I was part of all that, and that's what I believed. But I believe I had sincere faith in Christ. I prayed, I genuinely believed.
Mhm.
But I can't say my faith went beyond much of that. That
Mhm.
continued on into my teen years. And around the age of 17, 18, I started getting more serious about my faith, and I began looking into the Reformation, really. And at the time, coming from a non-denominational evangelical church, as you may or you may know, or it's often said about those groups, they're not very. We know they're not high church, but they're also not very interested in theology,
Yeah.
Or history, really.
Mhm.
And I began getting more serious about not only my faith, but studying, school, these types of things. And lo and behold, I came across the White Horse Inn, which is this organization that's still around today. Today they're called Sola Media, but they used to be Christians United for Reformation. This is Michael Horton. He's down here in Escondido at Westminster Theological Seminary. And long story short, these are Reformed Presbyterian Calvinists, right? So I fell in, hook, line, and sinker. I was convinced of the Calvinist position. I became convinced of TULIP, the 5 points of Calvinism. I believed in, predestination. I believed in, election. I believed in perseverance of the saints. I began reading the systematic theologies and, the Westminster Confession of Faith and the larger and smaller catechisms. And, the Reformation really began to shape my entire understanding of Christianity. And this went on for several years. I ended up, and by the way, I hope I'm not being too long-winded here, Jake.
Oh, no, don't worry about it. I love learning, man.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
I hope this will have a benefit later down the road as we're talking more to kind of know, what my background is and whatnot. So I ended up studying, I studied philosophy at UCLA. And please understand at this point, I'm well into, I've been a Protestant for, a good 3 or 4 or 5 years. I considered myself, at the time, fairly well read. I was not a casual Calvinist. I was one of those guys that, like you were talking about, I was online, I'm debating people, you know what I mean? I'm having those conversations. That's who I was. And I think it's in many ways, it's a good thing to do. Lo and behold, a couple of things that I now see as part of God's providence happened in my life. One, I met this gentleman who was also studying philosophy at UCLA, and his name was Jeremy, also, interestingly. And this guy was a Roman Catholic. And I will concede that up to this point in my life, I really had very little interaction with Roman Catholicism. It just wasn't really on our family's radar. None of our family was Roman Catholic. We were all these Protestants that had come out of, that Jesus revolution, as I told you about. So all we really knew was evangelicalism. So Roman Catholicism was kind of this unknown thing. All I knew as a Calvinist was I'm not Roman Catholic, right? Because I denied a lot of their major doctrines. And so he and I entered into a conversation, Jacob, that lasted really for the next probably year and a half to 2 years. And it turned out, to this day, he's one of the most intelligent men I've ever known. He's extremely sharp, articulate. He was a excellent advocate for his Roman Catholic position. And really where our arguments began to kind of coalesce and focus was on sola scriptura. That's a big one. And, to my mind, as a, Reformed Protestant, I was like, I got this guy. I'm gonna wipe the floor with him. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And Jacob, I tell you, it was one of the most scary and transformative experiences of my life over that course of probably about a year and a half, to where I started to realize that on the issue of sola scriptura, he was getting the best of me again and again and again. And I started to panic in some ways. I was going to the elders at my church. I was talking to my good friends who were also, very Reformed Calvinists. We'd study together, we were like, there's got to be answers, right? We got to find answers. There's no way that this Roman Catholic guy could be right? Of course not. He's Roman Catholic. He's got to be wrong. And so what happens during this period is those cracks, if you will, all right, the cracks in the foundation of my Protestantism began to grow. Because what I started to realize is that, and again, to my mind, we can talk about these things, but to my mind, the Protestant response and the Protestant arguments supporting sola scriptura simply were left wanting. They simply were not convincing. And so that really, really kind of rocked my world, right? Rocked my world. I talked about when I began this part of how two things came together during this time period. The second one, while all this is going on and I'm having these conversations and even debates, with this Roman Catholic, and then it turned, obviously other people as well, and dialoguing with my elders and my friends and all these things, I was also reading Fyodor Dostoevsky. I was reading The Brothers Karamazov, which I'm not sure if you've read Dostoevsky yet.
I have Crime and Punishment on my bookshelf. I have not gotten into it yet, though.
Someday, my friend, someday. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Dostoevsky, obviously is a Russian Orthodox author. He's considered one of the greatest authors of all time. The Brothers Karamazov is considered one of the greatest works of fiction ever written. These types of things. And I was like headlong into this book. And I was absolutely floored by it. I loved it. I still have my copy of it somewhere here, and it's got every other word practically is underlined. I'm circling things, I'm annotating it like crazy. It was having a big impact on me. And so here's what was happening to me, Jacob. Here I am, this Reformed Presbyterian Calvinist, reading a Russian Orthodox author. Now, please understand, up to this stage, I had never heard of Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Never. It wasn't even on my radar. See, today it's interesting. Orthodoxy has so much of a presence online. Everyone's heard of Orthodoxy now. This is going back a ways. You didn't really know about it, right? It was like, oh, those Greeks over there, right? That's all I ever, figured. I had no knowledge of it whatsoever. So I'm reading Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky, when you come to read it, Jacob, he understands the human condition. He understands the struggle with sin and our existential, plight, and how we're trying to figure out, how do we deal with the problem of evil? How do we have faith in God when there's so much suffering on earth? All these, issues that Dostoevsky is just beautifully tearing into. I'm reading this, and I'm like, how can this be? How can Dostoevsky so greatly and clearly, deeply understand sin, salvation, grace, mercy, failure, how can he understand it so well? Mm-hmm. And he's not a Presbyterian Calvinist. Mm-hmm. He's this thing I've never even heard of. So those two combinations, and please understand, this whole period was really a period of like 3 years of my life, where I slowly began to kind of shed the rubrics. I don't want to call them shackles, but began to move away from this sola scriptura Protestant model that I had spent the entire, the majority, all of my life up to that point in. And I'll make this part more quick. I did look into Roman Catholicism, obviously, because that's who I was conversing with. I knew fairly quickly that I could not become, with good conscience, a Roman Catholic. There were a number of issues, because this is when, by the way, this obviously opened up an entirely new study for me. Up to this point, I had studied the Reformation, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Melanchthon, all that time period, really the last 500 years of church history. Well, now I picked up Philip Schaff's History of the Christian Church. So now I'm reading from the first century going forward. So my eyes are being opened to the entire 1500 years that preceded the Protestant Reformation. And so all of this kind of combined, I started to realize, okay, I'm not a Protestant anymore. I can't with good conscience call myself a Protestant because I don't believe in sola scriptura anymore. And I knew I couldn't go into Catholicism either for reasons we don't need to get into that right now. We can talk
Mhm.
Catholics on another day.
Mhm.
So it left me in a very kind of precarious position. For a while, I attended for a very short period of time. I went to an Anglican church.
Mhm.
I was searching, right? I was looking. I was like, where do I go?
Mhm.
And then finally, I picked up a book called The Orthodox Church by Callistos Ware. It's a famous book. It's a great book, and it's basically an introduction to Orthodoxy.
Mhm.
And that had a major impact on me. It's a powerful book. The first half of that book is all history, and then the second half is all the doctrine, right? The teachings of Orthodoxy.
Mhm.
And so during that time period, I decided, you know what, it's time. I need to visit an Orthodox church.
Mhm.
And Jacob, in some ways, the rest is history. But one of the first, it just so happened by God's grace, one of the first services I ever attended at an Orthodox church, it happened to be during Lent. And it was,
Mhm.
there's a service during Holy Week that it's called Holy Thursday.
Mhm.
And it's where Christ is put on the cross. So in Orthodoxy, it's very experiential.
Mhm.
It's not about just what you believe in your head. It's not checking a box, but you're participating in the worship of God when you're at church, when you're in the liturgy.
Mhm.
And long story short is there's a moment, and I'll never forget it because it's so powerful, where in essence, all the lights are out in the church. The only light that's in there is a couple candles,
Mhm.
um, and Christ is literally taken from the cross is taken, and Christ's body is brought and is placed on the cross. It's kind of a reenactment, if you will, of
Mhm.
Christ being nailed to the cross, and the priest literally has a hammer and nails these nails into the cross. And it's such a powerful visceral thing because during this whole service as you're reading the 12 gospels, you're hearing the story of the passion of Christ, and you feel like you're there, Jacob. Like you
Mhm.
feel like you were there 2000 years ago when Christ is being hammered to the cross. And I was like, that's it. There's no, from that point forward, I could never with good conscience step foot in a church other than an Orthodox church. Now, please understand, I've been
Mhm.
to other churches over the years. I'm not trying to say I would never step foot. What I
Yeah.
mean is, yeah, I as a Christian wouldn't be attending regularly
Mhm.
a Protestant church anymore. Um, and yeah, I was eventually chrismated into the Orthodox Church. Thanks be to God, and I've been an Orthodox Christian since. And that's that my story, Jacob. And I'm sorry if that was a little long winded.
Oh, don't dude, I love hearing stories. I'm glad how you were able to like articulate it that much. It was great. And so I want to go into a little bit about like the liturgy of you told me about like the special day, Holy Thursday. And I do want to say I am planning on in a couple weeks when my friend gets back from an internship. He's across the state. We're gonna go visit a Greek Orthodox church,
Oh, cool.
and it's like about 5 miles from my house, so I might as
Nice.
well check it out. And then I do want to go into like what should I expect from the liturgy, like everyday liturgy, and what's like the thinking behind what's going on there.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, Jacob, it's exciting. I'm glad you're doing that because you maybe have already heard, Orthodox were kind of famous for saying this, which is you got to come and see, right?
Mhm.
Orthodoxy is not something that you can understand by reading a book, right? You can't just pick up a book and be like, oh yeah, I read this book and I believe, so I'm Orthodox. Like it just doesn't work that way. You have to come and be part of the community of be part of the because really, and I'll get into this, but the liturgy is what we call the divine liturgy, which, by the way, Jacob, has been practiced in its current form basically for 1,700 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, let that sink in for a second, right? When you compare that to what's happening in the vast majority of evangelical churches here in America, you're lucky if they've been doing what they're doing for the past 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they might have been doing it for 2 weeks. And in the Orthodox Church, our liturgy, it's the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, and we actually do liturgies throughout the year of the liturgy of St. James, which is even older. So you've got this practice that is literally ancient, right? It's literally ancient. That is, we see it as heaven meeting earth, right? Earth meeting heaven. We read about in Revelation, right? The beautiful liturgy that's going on before the throne of Christ, right? As you know, I'm sure that you can read about it in Revelation 7, Revelation 20, where the angels, the saints of God, are praising and praying and bringing forth the prayers of the saints to Christ, and there's incense, and it's this beautiful, elaborate choreography, right, that we have come to know as the liturgy. And so the way we view liturgy, Jacob, you asked what to expect. Expect a very reverent opportunity to come before God in spirit and in truth, as we know Scripture says. But there's even, with the beautiful thing about Orthodoxy, and I hope you can experience this, is it's physical too, right? That's the part I feel like is left out a lot in Protestantism. I felt like for so many years as a Reformed Protestant, my Christianity was right up here. Mm-hmm. Why? Well, because I could define for you my soteriology. I had my systematic theologies. I knew my proof texts. And so because I had this, that was my faith in many ways. Now, I'm not trying to, say that is the Protestant view, because of course not. I know Protestants want to follow Christ and live in their faith, etc. as well. I get it. But the tendency I find is with those views is that the intellect, the intellectual assent to the right doctrines is so emphasized that the faith becomes almost this intellectual enterprise. Whereas in Orthodoxy, Jacob, what you can expect, the total opposite. Now, that's not to say it's not intellectual. There are certainly, we have volumes and volumes and volumes of writings and theologians, everyone from St. John of Damascus, St. Maximus the Confessor, to, modern Losky. And there's so many brilliant minds who have devoted their talents to the faith. So Orthodoxy is in no way anti-intellectual, believe me. But the liturgy is so much more than that, right? You're going to come into an environment that is going to be very different, I would imagine, than what you've experienced. You're almost right away, Jacob, when you walk in the door, you're going to smell incense. And it's going to be this scent that you can come to learn. It's like, man, I'm in a different environment now. It's just one of the ways, right, of the five senses. There's the touch. You're going to see the icons. There's the vestments of the priests, right? The way people are dressed. You might notice many of the women are wearing a veil. The chanting is gonna feel a certain way. The prayers of the priests are sung typically. So there's all this. It has a very different feeling to it, and the reason for that is not just because, oh, Jacob, we Orthodox, we like kind of stuff like that. So aesthetically, we just want it that way. And you're like, well, that's cool aesthetically. Like, that's not it. It's actually rooted in the practices that came all the way back to the Old Testament, right? What do we know? What did God command? Not just recommend. God didn't recommend to the Levitical priesthood, to the early temple priests. He didn't recommend, hey guys, you guys should probably be a little bit higher church. It's
Mhm.
probably good for you. You might enjoy it. It's pretty.
Mhm.
No, right? He commands them. You will do this. You're going to put, you're going to create, these images on the Ark of the Covenant, right? You're going to use incense. The priest will have vestments, right? It all goes back to the Old Testament.
Mhm.
And then, as you know, right, that practice continues even into the time of our Lord and Savior Christ Jesus. And they're involved in the synagogue and the temple up until, AD 74 when the temple is destroyed. Um, this Christianity in its infancy was very rooted in that, Jewish temple practice. And so those Christians took that on and it's continued. Like I said, Jacob, our liturgy, we argue it goes back all the way. It's just
Mhm.
that it's in its form it's in now at the most conservative estimate you can come up with, at least for 1700 years, we've been practicing this liturgy. And so I hope I'm coming at an answer for you. The,
Mhm.
the experience is one, if you allow yourself, Jacob, is going to be very different and hopefully even transformational. The reason I say if you allow yourself, I think it's very possible, and I'm not saying this about you in particular, but I think it's very possible for a person to come into an Orthodox church, to sit through an entire, and when I say sit, I should mean stand. You'll stand a lot. We'll,
Yeah, that's what I heard.
yeah, we'll stand through a liturgy and we'll come out of it unchanged. Just be like, yeah. And I thought it was weird. Those priests, why do they repeat themselves so much? And, doesn't the Bible talk about vain repetition? And man, all those icons, they were kind of creepy. And, doesn't the Bible talk about, we shouldn't make images? And in other words, how you approach coming to Orthodoxy, coming to an Orthodox service
Mhm.
will have a huge impact on how you experience it. So I would just encourage you to come in, God willing, with just an open mind, just,
Mhm.
like I said, maybe give it the benefit of the doubt and see what you think, what you feel, do you see Christian people there, worshiping God,
Mhm.
sincerely, do you see God moving in his people? So anyway, sorry, I apologize. I'm
Oh,
talking too much.
don't worry about it. No, I've been to two Catholic masses before, and I thought they were both beautiful. One was at a Newman Center by the college I lived by. It
Oh,
was
yeah.
very tiny, still beautiful. And then the other was in like a kind of like a cathedral. I don't know if it's can be classified as that. It was huge. It
Hmm.
was beautiful. It's just something like felt off. I went into both with like an open mind. I
Yeah.
am open to being Catholic or Orthodox. I see you guys as Christians when y'all go to church. I see you as
Amen.
worshiping the Lord. I love both of y'all and that stuff.
I
But
appreciate that.
it's
By the
just
way, Jacob, where do you live? Where are you at? In what state?
I'm in North Carolina
Oh,
right
okay.
now. I'd rather not say which
No,
city.
no, yeah, no, that's
I
fine.
yeah,
For sure.
I've said some crazy things about Muslims online. Yeah, but that is and yeah, so the one I'm going to, it's about 5 miles from my house. I talked to another guy named Maximus Patho, I think OTP, and he was telling me about the liturgy as well
Awesome.
online. I've been going back and forth with him
Great.
over text on that about that. But I am like very interested in all that stuff. I'm going into it with an open mind. It's just for me is like I'm worried about. I do want to like see the beauty in all of it. One of
Mhm.
the things is you know, I was in like kind of a depressive state for the past few months. With my fiance is in college. I'm not. I work construction. I'm a project manager,
Oh,
and
wow.
she lives in a different state, and so she went back with her family for the summer. And so I'm like, well, I have like nothing going on. I have nothing to do. And so I got a little depressed. And then like one of the things that broke me out was like seeing the beauty in the world that God has placed, seeing creativity that God has, built for humans. And I
Yeah,
love how the Orthodox Catholics, and especially, I don't want to leave them out, high church Protestants,
sure.
emphasize beauty in churches too. And so I am
Absolutely.
very excited to see what it's like. And I just want to be able to experience different things. But for me, I want to focus more on like I am very interested in the theology behind it. I've heard of a different person I was watching said he converted to Greek Orthodoxy because of the negative theology of it,
Mhm,
where
mhm.
it's like how he explained it was, and I imagine you'll probably be able to explain it better, but is we know what God isn't, but we aren't going to say what He is because of
Right.
mischaracterizing. And I really loved how he said that because quickly, I really dislike when people try and make examples of the Trinity because no matter what, you're going to commit some form of heresy, and it's just.
Mhm.
Could you explain to me a little bit of that negative theology?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So what you're describing there is what is often called apophatic. So
Hmm.
it's Greek, right? Apophatic
Okay.
theology. And it's, you nailed it. You're exactly right. It
Hmm.
is that we as finite creatures, right? Our brains, right? We are only capable of so much,
Hmm.
that God, who is infinite, right? As we know, all the, omnipresent, omniscient, I mean,
Hmm.
omnibenevolent, right? He has existed forever. His existence, we can't even really fathom even talking about what does existence even mean when you
Hmm.
talk about God, right? So the Eastern fathers have used this apophatic approach when talking about God, is that to say we cannot put barriers, we cannot put uh, structures around God. We can't define God to say, okay, God fits in this box right here, right? You see that box, Jacob? That's
Hmm.
God. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to define him for you. Rather, we can say, well, look, we definitely know what God is not, right?
Hmm.
We know he's not the author of sin, right? We know that God is not a hateful being, right? We can start talking about these things, and so that's where that negative view comes in terms of, I think negative is kind of a uh, not a great descriptor because it sounds like it's bad in some way, but that's why that word apophatic is very important.
Hmm.
To understand that no, we're simply saying that God is so outside of us that we as his creatures can only approach, hopefully in humility,
Hmm.
um, and a huge dose of, understanding that, hey, we're doing the
Hmm.
best we can, right? To describe the nature of God in a way that really is so limited, that we have to just always understand that, because I feel, to use one example, Jacob, the LDS faith. I'm not sure if you've spent much time talking with our LDS friends. I've spent some time studying that faith and their history and all that, and they, to my mind, are like the opposite of the Orthodox when it comes to describing God, because they believe that God was once a man, just like you and me. He walked an earth just like this one,
Hmm.
and he was eventually exalted to become a god of his own planet and procreating spirit children, all these things. That God, I can understand that pretty well, right? I
Hmm.
think we can
Yeah.
be very, descriptive about God when he's a guy just like you and me. So that I would use as an example, as a counter example to
Hmm.
what we know as Christians. God is not that whatsoever, right? God is not a
Hmm.
creature. God is outside of all of that. So that, yeah, that apophatic view, it's a beautiful testament. And I want to tell you, Jacob, it says more too about really orthodoxy in general, because
Hmm.
this is actually a huge distinction between the Orthodox and Roman Catholics.
Hmm.
We believe that after the Great Schism in 1054, and you have, the rise of this kind of Western scholasticism,
Hmm.
obviously with Thomas Aquinas and those that followed, this rigorous dogmatism where the doctrines were being defined, right? It's like the Roman Catholics are famous for their catechism. It's like, you need an answer, look it up in the catechism. The Roman Catholic view on it because they've defined it. And, obviously, famously, this is where the Aristotelian metaphysics come in through Aquinas to
Hmm.
describe even the Eucharist, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
use the term transubstantiation, right? He goes
Mm-hmm.
into an entire theology, which, by the way, Orthodox do not hold to. Orthodox do not teach or believe in transubstantiation
Mm-hmm.
because we believe, and I think it's a beautiful strength of Orthodoxy is we don't get caught up in, oh, we're going to tell you how it works. I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to tell you from a philosophical or scientific perspective, here's how the body and the bread and wine change into the body and blood of Christ. As Orthodox, we simply say, and we're happy to say, it's a mystery of God.
Mm-hmm.
All we know is we believe it, right? And this is tied to that apophatic understanding. We believe the Roman Catholics go too far.
Mm-hmm.
They want it because they want to define everything. It leads to problems. And like I said, Aristotelian metaphysics is one of
Yeah.
them. Okay. So, anyways, I hope that's a helpful approach to a kind of a quick response related to that apophatic teaching.
No, yeah, it's very helpful. I was when I first saw the thing about the negative theology, the first thing I thought, this is two things, and also bouncing off the Thomas Aquinas Aristotelian thing. But the first thing about the negative theology was that, okay, this could be very useful against atheists, LDS, Islam, because when I first looked into the religions, I've looked into a lot about Islam, not really that much about LDS, but I know the basics. But
Mhm.
it's really just them trying to be able to comprehend God and
Yes.
failing at it, especially with Arianism. I mean, the whole thing behind Islam is, oh, the Trinity is too confusing. Three gods. Oh, God was a man. How can God die? And it's really like, okay, you don't want to like actually be smart or just give up your pride and be like, okay, God is a metaphysical being. How am I going to understand him? And I think that's one of the beauties of it. And I think where Martin Luther really nailed this is I was reading a biography about Martin Luther by Eric Metaxas,
Yep.
and he said that Martin Luther stated many times that he was glad to see Aristotle and scholasticism die and the Bible and Christ be fulfilled, because that was one of the things they idolized, like that
Yeah.
philosophy, that Greek philosophy. And like I saw one thing even about like how many angels can dance on a pin or something. I was like, I can't believe this was actually
Right.
happening. And
Right.
that's like one of the things I would love to do another episode going on, like Catholicism and the papacy and all that stuff with
Sure.
you. But
Absolutely.
so, and with that, how does so I want to know about Armenianism within the Orthodox Church. So how did going from Calvinistic worldview to an Armenianistic worldview, how did that go for you? Like, was it like an easy jump for you over into that? And what are kind of like, why is the Orthodox Church Armenian?
So interestingly, I wouldn't say it is Armenian.
Okay.
It's
That's what I've heard. I'm sorry.
yeah, no, it's
That's my
okay.
understanding.
It's
Okay.
I understand where that concept comes from. I
Okay.
just think it's somewhat of a misplaced understanding. I
Okay.
think that you know I guess it's almost like a false dichotomy, right? The
Okay.
opposite of Calvinism um, isn't necessarily Armenianism. There
Mhm.
are other ways, right? Because really, the soteriology, right, of Orthodoxy is really is unique.
Mhm.
It's not shared because as you know, right, we have our Armenian brothers and sisters in lots of Protestant churches around the
Mhm.
country, right around the world, and I would argue that their Protestant version, their Armenianism and their Protestantism is a kind of that's also kind of unique, right? And
Yeah.
it's as we know, it's also kind of a novelty in the church. Whereas in Orthodoxy, because of our history, we're just in a different category, right? Our view of salvation goes all the way back to first Clement, if you want to talk about the first century, right after the time of the apostles. And obviously it goes back to the scriptures, but I'm just saying in terms of if we want to talk history, um,
Mhm.
our theology was there in Ignatius and in Polycarp and Barnabas and these early writings, the Didache, etc. And because of that, that's why I'm not super comfortable with saying that Orthodox soteriology is Armenian. Does that make sense? I,
Yeah.
I I think that we can have a conversation. Like, I don't get me wrong. Like I said, I get where that you're coming from. I just think that a better way of describing it is that orthodoxy has, and allow me to do this, has an orthodox view of soteriology, small o, right? Orthodox, small o. And that soteriology is, I'm sure you've heard this term as well, as theosis, right?
Mhm.
We believe that salvation is not really about the categories. See, I think that's where the Calvinist and the Armenian debate structures things in a way that it's like there's the Armenian box against the Calvinist box, and these two boxes kind of war with one another. And I think in reality, the truth, as Orthodox often say, is it's both and it's all, right? It's a comprehensive, holistic approach, meaning, do we believe Paul when he writes about the church being predestined right before the foundation of the world, and these types of passages that are incredibly powerful and talking about predestination and election? Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's in
Mhm.
scripture. We as Orthodox read those passages with no problem whatsoever, right? Without falling into the overemphasis that unfortunately the Calvinists have done, we would argue. And
Mhm.
so the view of justification, right? In Protestantism, justification is kind of in its own box, right? And that's different from sanctification, right? And then glorification. These are kind of these different categories. And I would argue, Jacob, those categories are a result of the Protestant Reformation.
Mhm.
Historically, the church, and you can read this, right? You go and read the early writers of the church, certainly John Chrysostom, Saint Gregory, etc. They talk about the faith and coming to salvation as really it's a participation in the love and grace of God, right? It's a conforming your entire life to
Mhm.
Christ. It's not about, oh well, on this date I said a prayer and so I was regenerated, and then my regeneration led to my justification, which is my penal substitutionary statement, right?
Mhm.
I am now Christ the Paraclete. I'm seen as being holy, when even though ontologically and in reality I'm still a worthless sinner, right?
Mhm.
And then now the rest of my life will be lived out through this sanctification process. None of that, I
Mhm.
would argue, none of that is Orthodox, small o. That
Mhm.
is all Protestantism, whether you're talking about it from the Armenian mindset or the Calvinist mindset.
Mhm.
Those categories, it's like we're making category mistakes. I would say.
Okay.
Um, so is that making sense? Is that kind of
Yeah, it
help?
is. This makes sense. It sounds a little bit, from what I've learned a little bit about Lutheranism, not saying that Orthodoxy and Lutheranism are the same, but from what I've learned about that is that they have their own way. They're not Calvinistic, but they have their own way to label mysteries of the church and that too. So, like, since we talked about the Reformation, could you tell me, how do you view the Reformation now as having become Orthodox? I really want to focus on like the early Reformation, like
Mhm,
right as it started happening. And then
mhm.
if you want to, we can talk about, what it's become now.
Sure, sure. See, it's an excellent question, Jacob. And by way of answer, I would say that Orthodox, and there's actually a fascinating history related to Orthodoxy and that early Reformation, including Luther himself.
Mhm.
As you know, I'm sure Luther dialogued, and really those who followed Luther, Melanchthon in particular, they continued this dialogue with the patriarch in Constantinople. There was this very real dialogue that was going on for some time. It's very interesting. But the reason I bring that up is because I want to be clear that I understand what you're saying in terms of the early Reformation looks
Mhm.
so different from what we see in modern Protestantism, right?
Yeah.
Some people are even going around now, I'm sure you know, right? Zoomer always says this. Austin Suggs, even of Gospel Simplicity, I think hints at it sometimes. They wonder if non-denominationals are even Protestant, right? That
I hear
conversation.
that like all the time. I got into like an argument with a Catholic dude on Instagram, and he has in his bio non-denominational to Roman Catholic. And I put in a comment and made a response video. I was like, "You are a non-denominational evangelical. Why are you like saying you were like some ex-Protestant?" And some girl in the comments kept commenting like, "But non-denominational is Protestant." I said, "It literally means it's not a denomination." She said, "It's a denomination." I was like, "Oh my gosh."
It's
It was such a fun back and forth.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. That is because that's
Yeah.
it. I'll be honest with you, Jacob. It's a fascinating
Uh-huh.
conversation, and I think it's
Yeah.
probably not the scope of our talk today.
Yeah.
But I would like to go down that road
Mhm.
someday because I see it from both sides.
Mhm.
I see how the non-denominational evangelical kind of craziness that we're witnessing before us, unfortunately, it's so sad,
Mhm.
has led to so much confusion and craziness, just where people, you see it, right? This Pentecostal, thing that's going on right now where everyone's shaking and speaking in tongues and all this kind of stuff. It is so, to me, it's not even Christian, let alone is it a denomination. I feel like it's not even Christian anymore. We've left the planet, right? We've left the island. It's not on the Christian island anymore. I think it's a more nuanced conversation. Whether or at what stage did the Anabaptists and eventually, the non-denominationalists, when did or have they completely left the Protestant umbrella? Right. It's a fascinating conversation, and maybe we could have that conversation down the road someday. Or I'd love to hear you talk about that more as you move forward.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, getting back to what we were talking about, Orthodox, in many ways, were not really that interested in or concerned about, it might surprise you, the Reformation. If you look at history and you see the great divide that began happening in the church really early on, going back even to the 7th, 6th, 7th, 8th century, the West began Latin, right? What became the main language. They weren't reading or speaking Greek anymore. In the East, most of them still speaking Greek or Arabic. In other words, this divide between really is so much bigger than even just the filioque, which we can of course talk about.
Mhm.
But the leading up to the 1054 Great Schism, the East was already, they were under persecution from the Muslims. They were kind of having to deal with their own issues, and they were so separated from, right? They didn't live in the internet world, right? There was no cell phones. There was no, they didn't see what was going on over there. And so we as Orthodox and historically, the great, schism, you got Rome here, and then it was, 500 years later, roughly, then the Protestant Reformation is all over here. Meanwhile, Orthodox are way down here. We just really didn't even, it wasn't on our radar. And I say this for a reason. The Protestant Reformation, what so clearly defines it, and I think even defines it to this day in your historical Protestant churches, your Presbyterians, your Lutherans, and I'm talking about the conservative ones, all to those early, Reformation values and doctrines. They still see themselves as, we are not Catholic, right? They literally are still protesting against the Roman Catholic Church. Their doctrines are, and believe me, I know, my father is a Reformed Presbyterian Calvinist. He lives with me. I still listen to a lot of the things he listens to because I think it's fascinating, because I like to kind of know what's being said. I hear it with my own ears. They are still very much kind of rooted in this anti-Catholicism. The reason that's important to answer your question, Jacob, is that Orthodox we're not anti-Catholic and we're not anti-Protestant. We're not protesting against anything. We've continued on in this unbroken line for now 2,000 years, and we see it as, really, you'll hear it said, the first Protestants were the Roman Catholics, because when they broke, unilaterally made a change to the creed and said, Rome on its own is now, right, gonna kind of dictatorially determine who the bishops are, etc. So that move for us, it's like they're now the other, and the Protestants are even further removed from that because they're just a break from Rome. And so I hope that's helping to paint a picture, Jacob, in terms of how we view how radically different are even conservative Lutherans, right? Lutherans that hold to really a lot of, they believe in the body and blood of Christ, right? In the Eucharist. They're very clear about that. And that's a beautiful thing. But even that, right? Even in that, they've slightly changed, right? Their view of it. I'm sure you've heard the talk of, the
consubstantiation. Is that what it is?
Consubstantiation, it's sometimes called, although some Lutherans say, well, we're not really consubstantiationists. You have what's a term called ubiquity, which Luther famously or infamously talked about. I'm sure if you heard about that, where he believed that Christ, even in his physical sense, his physical body was somehow able to be everywhere at all times. It's kind of an odd thing, and he's the only Christian in all of human history that's ever talked about it that way.
When I watched the video about it, I was like, this is breaking my brain. I don't know about this one.
Yeah.
But, and I do believe, I don't think Martin Luther or John Calvin saw like non-denominationalism or like Pentecostalism was coming at all. Now, I come from like a Pentecostal background. I'd say I'm a Reformed Baptist now, and my dad's a Pentecostal pastor. And the thing with like Pentecostalism is like it is always represented online, especially like by its worst people. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of it. It attracts a lot of crazy people. Do not get me wrong. I mean, there's like people who like turn speaking in tongues on and off, and I'm like, you are doing this for show, and like other people will admit it in the church, and they think it's crazy too. But there's a lot of I'd say there are a lot of normal people in Pentecostalism who just believe in theology and the missions, because I mean, if high church Protestantism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, if they were like evangelizing how those Pentecostals and non-denominationalists were doing it, it would be like so much bigger. It's like amazing how they're like spreading out, and that's kind of just like their whole theology. It's like, but it's insane how like even like the non-denominationals, they won't even look back to the Reformation as history. They just like I've heard like so many people say like online, and it's not that bad of an argument, but it is like, I mean, it's wrong. He's like, well, just because it's historical doesn't mean it's right. It was like, well, does that mean we should completely abandon, like not look into the history and decide where is right and that stuff?
Right.
So that's one of like the most interesting things for me with like the non-denominational and Reformation.
Can I say something to that real fast, Jacob?
Yes, I think absolutely.
Something historically and philosophically the proper view is, as you know, if something is the established doctrine, in other words, you take the orthodoxy in the case we're talking about now, you take orthodoxy, right? And then 1,500 years later, you have the Protestant view come along. The burden of proof is not on the Orthodox. You understand this, right? The burden of proof is on the newcomer. The burden of proof is on the guy who's saying, hey, no, you guys got something wrong here. Let me tell you how it really is. That's the person that has to prove up their position, not the position that's been there all along, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that Orthodox don't have to, give an argument for their view, of course. But you see what I'm saying? It's like,
I hear what you're saying.
and it sounds like you were right on to that. When people want to divorce themselves so much from any history, they just don't care. They're doing themselves a major disservice. And let's be frank, Jacob, they don't know it, but they're being arrogant. They're being intellectually arrogant because they're saying, no, this is our position and we don't care what you've been doing for 2,000 years. Our view is right, even though our church was started in 1982. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's the thing. So, but like just talking about the Reformation in history, I want to go
Yeah.
over some of the councils, and then especially leading up to the Great Schism and about the filioque.
Yeah.
And that's I hear all the time about the filioque. Don't really understand it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the Great Schism, I've heard about it a lot. I kind of want to understand what was like going through everything about that.
Well, please preface this by, anyone listening to this right now, please understand Jacob and I could spend the next 6 hours, unpacking that question. But to give you a kind of a synopsis and, Lord have mercy upon me to try to be as faithful as possible. Because it's a super important question, Jacob, and it really gets to the heart of understanding the world today, understanding Christianity today. You have to understand this. I truly believe, and this was very, by the way, foundational for me. It was one of the major factors that led to my leaving Protestantism as a whole and coming to Orthodoxy. So going back to the early centuries of the church, as you know, right, the gospel began to spread, and it was spreading very quickly around the known world at the time, and that was all of what we understand to be around Southern Europe, Northern Africa, what we call today the Middle East, right? This whole region into Asia and even India. Christianity was spreading, and because of the political and kind of real earth realities of the time, you had these major focal points, these capitals, if you were, of the world, and by consequence, then they became capitals of the faith. And that is, for example, obviously Jerusalem, Alexandria in Egypt. You had Rome, Constantinople, and Antioch. Okay. And these were they were called the five C's, right? The five patriarchates. And this is very important. I hope this isn't boring. These five seas were really the major centers of where most of the populations lived. It's where you had the concentration of the church leadership, right? The bishops were there, and these regions were what came together, for example, in 325, when you had the Arian heresy, which was running rampant in the church. As you know, I'm sure famously, Constantine, the emperor in Constantinople, he calls the first, what we come to know as the first ecumenical council. We really see the first council as in Acts chapter 15. But historically, we come to know these ecumenical councils. The church comes together. Who came together, Jacob? It was bishops from Jerusalem, Alexandria, Rome, Antioch, and Constantinople, right? These five centers were represented Christianity as a whole. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this model continues on for roughly 1,000 years, right? Where when the church would come together in council, all five of these church centers, these C's, were represented. Now, here's what happened with the filioque, and really ultimately the great schism of the church, unfortunately, is that, let's say this is Rome, right? So you've got the four other patriarchates: Alexandria, Jerusalem, Constantinople, Antioch. Rome, through a long history, which we won't get into now, but it had to do with the Germanic, Frankish peoples, the tribes that were in Northern Europe, were combating Arianism. And please understand, they were very removed. They were far removed from the East. Their thing. Those read about all this. It's all well documented. There's great histories. So I would encourage you to just dig into all of it, man. You're going to learn so much. That the theology that they were practicing, they began way before Rome ever did. They began adding what's called the filioque, which is just a Latin term. It's a Latin phrase, which means "and the Son." And so in the creed that was established in the first two councils of the church, that every church on earth, every Christian body on earth holds to the Nicene Constantinople Creed, right? I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, right? It goes on and on. And in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father. And as you know, the creed stops there, and so does Scripture. That's a direct quote from Scripture. Well, in Northern Europe, in this Frankish region, they started adding in this phrase right there, the filioque, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. So they began adding this idea that the Son, because please understand, they were well-intentioned. They're not evil people, but they wanted so badly to establish the deity of Christ against these Arians that they thought it was justified to add this creed. Now, please understand, this is so important. Rome, even Rome, you go back to Pope Leo the Great, he was adamant, you cannot change the creed. Like, we can talk about the theology, but you can't change the creed, because the creed is what the entire church on earth believes, and we instantiated it hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So Pope Leo, and you heard me correct, Pope Leo the Great, he had the creed written out on these metal plates. The history kind of is unclear about what kind of metal was used. On these metal plates, he wrote the creed without the filioque and had them put on the doors so that all the people in Rome could see the creed, no filioque. That's how clear he wanted to be, that you can't change the creed, okay? Now, that's Rome in the 7th, 8th century. Slowly, because of a lot of factors, the Ottomans, the wars that were going on, the continued separation between East and West, Rome became very dependent on military power, and the East wasn't able to give it because we were struggling ourselves to keep ourselves alive against the Ottomans. So in the West, who did they look to? There's a guy very famously, you'll come to learn all this, Jacob, named Charlemagne, who he was king, he wanted to become emperor. He was from that northern region I was telling you about, where they were using the filioque for years, even though the Pope and Rome didn't want them to. He comes in and offers military, hey, I'll take care, we'll protect you, we've got the military power. However, he also brought all of his Frankish, Germanic bishops and priests with him. And guess what? Charlemagne, who wanted to rule the world, elected, if you will, or brought in the next pope. He brought in his own pope, who actually oversaw his crowning as the emperor, even though there still was an emperor in the East. That again, showing about the differences, how separated they became.
Yeah.
So please understand what happened here. This non-Roman Germanic, Frankish theology of the filioque came into Rome, and eventually, because of, frankly, sadly, politics, that Pope eventually allowed for the addition of the filioque. And it was, remember the 5 C's? The other 4 were saying, no, you guys, you can't do that. You can't change ecumenical creed. We're all against it. And Rome unilaterally, by themselves, said, we don't need to listen to you. We, Rome, are the church. And
so is that where they claimed infallibility?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
infallibility, believe it or not, didn't even come till 1884 in Vatican One. So, look, Jacob,
Wow.
I want to be fair to our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters. I have a lot of respect for our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, but I will tell you,
Hmm.
I, like I said, I didn't become Roman Catholic for a reason. I believe Roman Catholic theology is mired in problems. And
Hmm.
these are just a couple of them that you're pointing at right now. Um, the history, I believe, bears it out very clearly that Rome, they just got too big for their own, sake. They were politically ascendant because of Charlemagne. There's so many problems. Um, again, we don't need to get into it, but just to answer your question, so that unilateral action on account of Rome against the entire rest of Christendom. So that's what people leave out. It often gets forgotten because the East was under oppression for so long. They didn't have the political power of the West. So it's easy to forget them historically.
Hmm.
But against the entire rest of Christendom, Rome changes the creed. And to me, that is hard to overstate.
Hmm.
And then, sure enough, just shortly thereafter, you have the Protestant Reformation because Rome continued to fly off the rails, as you know, with the indulgences. You've got the stuff that was going on, and you had numerous popes running around, the controversies that were involved, the forced celibacy became to rear its head, all these things.
Hmm.
Whereas in the East, I'm telling you, Jacob, in the East, we stopped paying attention. Like I said, we really did because we had our own problems dealing with the Turks and the Muslims.
Hmm.
But in another sense, the East was just over there eating popcorn, watching the roller coaster show that was
Hmm.
Roman Catholicism and eventually the Protestant Reformation. So I hope that helps kind of answer that question or paint that picture. It's a fascinating history, and I only gave you that much of it. But
Hmm.
I do highly recommend to anyone watching this that's interested. There are so many great works on that time period. Definitely check it out.
Definitely. Yeah. I'm trying to on my channel start up like doing mini documentaries. Like I started out with doing one on, I don't know if you've heard of Jan Hus, kind of like the proto-reformer before the
Oh yeah,
Hussite Rebellion.
absolutely.
I
Yeah, yeah,
put I put like a little 11-minute video out there, but I want to start like doing more research and
that's
like
great.
making long ones.
That's
And
great.
especially one of them, I do want to do a multiple episode on the Great Schism. So I'm going to need help on that. And then one thing, I only have one more question left, and I think it's fitting to end it on. I've heard a couple different views on the Orthodox, on Revelations, on the end times. I want to hear like kind of what an Orthodox view is on the end times. How do
Sure.
y'all view Revelations and how things play out?
Jacob, this is gonna be interesting to you, I think, and
Okay.
unlike the entire rest of this interview, my answer here is going to be quite short. And here's
Hmm.
why. It is to my mind, one of the beauties of Orthodoxy. Here's our eschatology. You ready?
Hmm.
Christ one day will return for his church. I'm
I
not
like
joking.
that.
That's it.
Hmm.
That's our eschatology. Now, please understand the difference here.
Hmm.
As I told you in the beginning of our conversation, I was a pre-tribulational, you know, uh, dispensational
Hmm.
rapturist, right? That believed in all, the Antichrist, the seal, the 666, the number of the beast, all the stuff, right? Looking at, what's going on in Israel right now? Does this, how does this pertain to new, prophecy and end times prophecy? I was into all that craziness, and I mean craziness, because you talk about make it up as you go.
Yeah.
I hate to say it. I think it's rampant in those circles, and I feel bad for people caught up in it. And I've got friends and family that are still very much part
Hmm.
of that and in that. So I get it. And I've got nothing but love for them. I
Hmm.
just feel they have been duped. They've been duped by the powers that be. They're not bad themselves, but they believe something that has never been taught in all of Christianity up until, 150 years ago, you know?
Mhm.
So to kind of, sorry, to color the question here, or to color the answer, the contrast is so radical. But again, that is the beauty of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is not concerned really with what's to come, because why? The focus in orthodoxy, Jacob, is us right now. It's like, what are you doing right now? Right?
Mhm.
Have you submitted yourself, your heart to God today? Right? Have I been kind to my wife this morning? Right? Have Am I being loving to you in this moment? Right? It's This is what orthodoxy is concerned about, not this. Oh, let's talk about these prophecies for the next 2.5 hours, which I know some certain Christian groups can get into.
Mhm.
Now, I want to give one caveat. Okay, and you
Mhm.
might hear some of this online, and I think it's actually an unfortunate consequence of online orthodoxy.
Mhm.
There are a number of saints in the church, people in the church, the theologians, people who highly recommend and respect, etc. There's something in orthodoxy called pious opinion, and it's
Mhm.
an important distinction because there's actually very little actual doctrine
Mhm.
in orthodoxy. But you have certain fathers, and certain, even modern day saints, or people of blessed memory, who have commented on, have given opinions about what they think perhaps the
Mhm.
afterlife, or this eschatological view will be. So, can you have conversations about pious opinion within orthodoxy related to what is to come in end time speculation? Yeah, you can. You can get into some conversations,
Mhm.
but it's so important to understand the difference, right? It is not Orthodox doctrine. You might even hear sometimes people talk about the toll houses. Father Seraphim Rose talked about it. Um, it is not Orthodox doctrine. It is
Mhm.
not by any stretch of the imagination the view of the Orthodox Church. Is it something that's interesting, and can we talk about it? And might there be some truth to it? Yeah, there might be.
Mhm.
Right. But I just want to kind of caution you, because you probably will hear
Mhm.
Orthodox Christians who give an answer that might sound different from mine in relation to
Mhm.
eschatology, but from a purely dogmatic and doctrinal view, like, what is our eschatology? It's what I told you. It's that one day Christ will return for his church. Um, and as we know, right, new
Yeah.
heavens and new earth, and the culmination of all things, and we have that that blessed hope. So yeah. So I hope that's interesting
Yep.
for you. What were you
That
what
was
were
a
you,
great.
what were you thinking? I was curious. What were yours? Were you
Yeah.
expecting a different answer?
So I'd heard about full preterism before, that most of the events happened in the past, especially with a lot of Matthew 24, the destruction of Jerusalem. And me, I being a former dispensationalist, former rapture, the rapture actually created like a ton of anxiety for me. And I have like anxiety problems. So that was like it was like anxiety on steroids right there.
Yeah, one hundred
And I've
percent.
already, and it was kind of like, oh, what's happening in Israel? Is Matthew 24 coming true? Oh no. And then that feels just so like hearing like an answer like that. And that's kind of what I believe right now, especially I'm being reformed, is it just feels so much more relaxing, not
Yes.
have to worry and watch the news and, oh, is that happening now? Do I need to get my life right? It's like, no, I should like always be living my life right. I should always be gracious and loving to, everybody. And I just love that answer. But
Amen.
yeah, man, thank you for coming on. I had a great time with this. We got to do another episode sometime soon, and we'll work that out.
Jacob, God bless you. Thank you
Yes,
so
sir.
much. And I really genuinely, I wish you a great experience when you visit that Orthodox church. And I would just encourage you, however it goes, whether you love it,
Mhm.
hate it, or somewhere in between, try other churches as well.
Mhm.
Don't be afraid to visit some other parishes, or
Mhm.
even go to that parish again, Orthodoxy is, like I said, it's this big thing, and it's tough to say, that you can even absorb a tiny bit of it even in one go. But anyways, I'm really grateful for the opportunity, Jacob. I wish you the best in God's grace, and may our paths cross again soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you.